You're standing at your retirement party, holding a gold watch, and everyone in the room is acting like you've reached a finish line people have always known was there. That feels normal. Work hard, grow old, step away, and finally enjoy the years you earned. But that picture is new. Before state pensions existed, there was no guaranteed funded stage of life waiting for you at the end of work. If you got old and could not keep going, you usually leaned on family. If that failed, you had a real problem. Retirement was not introduced as a simple act of kindness. The man most often linked to inventing retirement built it inside a political fight, and the age he chose worked because most workers were not expected to live long enough to claim it. In June 1889, Germany's Reichstag passed the Old Age and Disability Insurance Law. It created the first state-run old age insurance program in the world. Workers who reached age 70 and had contributed for 30 years could receive a pension, with the cost shared by workers, employers, and the state. The name attached to that system is Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck did not back social insurance for just one reason. Historians describe a mix of motives, including concern for social stability and a reliable workforce. But politics sat right in the middle of it. Bismarck was also trying to gain support for the growing Social Democratic Party, using welfare as a carrot, while repressive anti-socialist laws worked as the stick. So retirement did not enter modern politics as a timeless human right. It entered as statecraft. To see what that meant on the ground, picture a laborer in the late 19th century. A man who has spent decades in fields, on a factory floor, or doing heavy work with his hands. He keeps going because stopping is not an option. Then his strength starts to fail. His back goes. His legs slow down. His hands stop doing what they used to do. Now what? Before pensions, the answer was often family. And if family could not carry the load, there was institutional poor relief. In England's Victorian workhouse system, about 30% of people over age 70 ended up in a workhouse by the late 19th century. That is what no retirement system looked like for many people. Not beach chairs, not travel. Family, if you were lucky. An institution, if you weren't. Here comes the original math. Germany set the pension age at 70. At the time, average life expectancy at birth in Germany was roughly 40 years, and only around 2% of the population reached age 70. That number needs one important qualifier. Life expectancy at birth was dragged down by high infant and child mortality, so a person who made it into adulthood had better odds than the raw average suggests. Even so, reaching 70 was still a minority outcome, which means the first big state retirement system was not built on the assumption that most workers would enjoy a long pension. It was built on the assumption that relatively few would ever collect one. That is why the system was affordable, and that is also why it was politically useful. A government could point to a pension and say it cared for workers, while the underlying math kept the cost contained. The idea did not stay in Germany. Decades later, the United States built its own national old age insurance system in the middle of a very different crisis. On August 15, 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act during the Great Depression. At the time, poverty among older Americans reportedly exceeded 50%. So the American case was not a copy-paste of Bismarck's Germany. It came out of mass economic collapse, but it carried the same broad promise. Old age should not automatically mean destitution. That promise spread, not all at once and not in exactly the same way in every country, but enough that retirement started to feel less like a policy choice and more like a natural stage of life. That feeling hardened after World War II. This is the part people usually remember as normal because, for a while, the numbers actually worked. In OECD countries around 1950, there were roughly 7.2 working-age adults for every person aged 65 or older. In the United States, Social Security had about 5.1 workers for every beneficiary in 1960. That is a very forgiving setup. A lot of workers paying in, relatively few retirees drawing out, and those retirees, on average, not spending decades in retirement. Under those conditions, pay-as-you-go pensions could feel sturdy and even generous. Current workers funded current retirees, and there were enough workers to make that arrangement look sustainable. This is when the modern expectation really locked in. Your grandparents or great-grandparents see retirement become common enough to feel real. Your parents grow up assuming there will be a retirement age. You grow up with workplace rituals, pension statements, social security projections, and the basic idea that one day work stops and a different phase begins. The system starts to feel like nature. It wasn't. It was demographics. Post-war retirement worked well because the population shape underneath it was unusually favorable. Lots of younger people, fewer older people, a broad base supporting a narrow top. Now reverse that shape. Global fertility has fallen from about 4.86 children per woman in 1950 to about 2.31 in 2023. Roughly 2/3 of humanity now lives in countries with fertility below the 2.1 replacement rate. Over the same period, life expectancy has kept rising. That trend is global, but the pressure is especially sharp in the richer, aging economies that built mature pension systems. So now, you have fewer future workers being born and more people surviving long enough to spend many years collecting benefits. The old support ratios start to buckle. In Europe, the old age dependency ratio stood at roughly one person aged 65 and over for every 4 working-age adults in 2010. Under current demographic trends, it is projected to move toward roughly 1 to 2 by 2050. That is not a small change. It means the same kind of system that once rested on a wide base of workers is now trying to balance on a much narrower one, while the group drawing benefits gets larger and lives longer. And this is the moment where the story flips. Retirement was designed as an actuarial bet that most workers would die before collecting, not as a promised reward for a long life. For a while, that bet still worked in a softer form because the post-war world supplied something almost as helpful, a huge pool of workers supporting a smaller retired population. But now the original pressure is back in a new shape. People are living longer than the old math comfortably allowed for, and there are fewer workers behind them. In other words, the system is straining because too many people are doing the thing modern medicine and prosperity taught us to hope for. They are surviving. So what happens when the wager stops behaving like a wager? Governments do the most obvious thing first. They move the age. Denmark has legislated an increase in its pension age to 70 by 2040. The United Kingdom is set to raise its state pension age to 68 by 2046. Across the OECD, the average normal retirement age is projected to rise from about 64.7 for men and 63.9 for women among those retiring in 2024 to about 66.4 and 65.9 for people starting careers in 2024. That is one response. Another is shifting more responsibility onto individuals. In the United States, defined contribution plans such as 401k have overtaken traditional employer-defined benefit pensions. By 2023, defined contribution plans covered about 93.4 million participants, compared with about 11.1 million in defined benefit plans. That changes the deal. A defined benefit pension says the institution carries more of the promise. A defined contribution plan says the worker carries more of the risk. You save, you invest, you absorb the market swings, and you find out later whether you guessed well enough. So when people say retirement is breaking, they usually mean one of two things. Either the public math is harder because there are fewer workers per retiree, or the private math is harder because more of the burden has been pushed onto individual households. Often, it is both. And that helps explain why the cracks feel so personal. The age moves, the guarantee weakens, the burden shifts. The finish line starts looking less like a fixed point and more like a negotiation between policy, demographics, and your own savings account, which brings you back to that retirement party. The gold watch still shows up, the speeches still happen, the cake still gets cut. But the meaning changes once you know where the idea came from. Retirement was never just the natural end of work. It was a political invention made affordable by selective survival at first and by favorable demographics later. What feels timeless was actually built on a temporary set of numbers. And numbers change, so if you are handed that watch, you are not just holding a reward, you are holding a wager.